Well, joining us now from Washington is Robert McDowell. President Bush appointed him to the FCC 3 years ago. And Commissioner, welcome to the 700 Club.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
All right, critics say the Fairness Doctrine would essentially shut down controversial discussions on the airways. So what do you think about that?
I think it would, and I think history shows us that that's what happened. As you had an excellent lead-in piece there that I was just watching, and radio stations, and it initially just affected radio because that's all there was really in 1949. Very few TV stations, but they were always very concerned that the FCC might yank their licenses, as you pointed out in that lead-in piece. So they tried to avoid controversial political discussions and instead aired shows about gardening or cooking or something else, which might be very worthwhile, but was not good for political discourse. So the FCC in 1985, 2 years before it abolished the Fairness Doctrine, came out with a study that actually showed that the Fairness Doctrine actually diminished the amount of political discourse over the airwaves, and that's a bad thing. I think we're better off today with a very robust discussion of issues through not just radio and television, but the internet as well.
Well, in those early days, there were three major networks, and maybe in broadcasting you had Mutual and a couple others, but on radio. But now we have such a proliferation of radio stations, thousands of them, not to mention the internet. So is the need for something like a Fairness Doctrine even appropriate in today's market?
I don't think so. And in 1969, that was the last time the Supreme Court looked at, really the only time the Supreme Court looked at the Fairness Doctrine. And it said at the time, we're looking at the state of the industry and state of technology and competition through the lens of 1969. So if you can come back to us someday with new information about new competition, new technologies, we might just overturn the constitutionality of the Fairness Doctrine. It was all based on the fact that, back in the 30s and 40s, there were probably fewer than 700 radio stations on the air throughout the entire country. And that was a concept called spectrum scarcity. And there was a fear that communist owners could own a radio station and just pump out propaganda. And then also, of course, during World War II, there was a concern that the fascists would do the same thing. Well, since then, we went from, let's say, 700 radio stations to over 20,000 or so TV stations and radio stations. Plus, you have satellite TV, satellite radio, and the internet with its millions and millions of outlets and the very low barriers to entry to set up a blog, for instance. So I don't see how there's any way this could survive a constitutional challenge before the Supreme Court. But I think the other concern, though, is that it might come back under a different name and a different sales pitch. So we all need to kind of watch out for legislation or what a future FCC might do.
Well, is this essentially an unwarranted scare that's going around now, or do you think it's real? Is there some feeling among your fellow commissioners that they'd actually vote the Fairness Doctrine back?
Well, there's only three of us right now. Sort of the FCC is in transition right now, and okay. I'm the only Republican on the FCC. But every couple of weeks, we hear some prominent member of Congress voice their support for the Fairness Doctrine or something like it. And by the way, some people call it the censorship doctrine, others call it the forced speech doctrine. I tend to call it just the doctrine, just to be fair. Mm-hmm. But in any case, every couple of weeks someone does speak up, or you'll have those competing amendments, like your story just pointed out, between Senators DeMint and Durbin, which then kind of roils up the debate again. So I think there's been enough activity and enough prominent members of Congress to talk about it recently to where we should continue to be vigilant and make sure it doesn't happen.
Well, thank you for the work you're doing and your clarity on this particular issue.
Well, thank you.
Commissioner Robert McDowell of the FCC, Federal Communications Commission. And we need to be diligent on this one. Right now, nothing has risen to the point where you'd really call it a crisis, but if it does, you need to bombard Congress, because this will shut down the left as well as the right. It's a sword that cuts both ways.
Yeah, I'm with you. Years ago, when this was in place, not only did you have to have the opposing view on, but you could not say which side of it, at least at the stations I worked at, you couldn't say which side of the coin you had a personal commitment
that wasn't necessary, but they went overboard because, I mean, your license when you're is an extremely valuable piece of property, and if the FCC says they're going to pull your license, I mean, it's a sword of Damocles. So in any event, it's been gone. and you have a proliferation. You've got Sean Hannity, you've got Rush Limbaugh, and you've got on the left. Who do you have? I mean, you got some of these.
Well, there's so much news on the air right now,
yeah.
and people need that to be able to listen to both sides and make a reasonable decision. And I think we're all smart enough to do that without intervention.
As the Commissioner said, there are over 20,000 outlets, and when you get the internet, I mean, good grief, all the blogs and the Wikipedias and all the junk that's out there now. I mean, there's enough information to choke an army. So let's hope, but it's not the fairness doctrine. There's nothing fair about it. It is a political restriction of free speech, anti-constitutional, terrible doctrine, and we don't need to see it reintroduced.